Hey everyone, welcome back to my second class in my two-part series on the poet Mary Oliver and other women poets. It's so nice to have you back. If you were here last week, especially welcome back. If you happen to be joining us for the first time, welcome. It's great to have you. I loved hearing from so many of you this past week following our first session, saying how much Oliver's poetry either resonated with you, or those of you who were already followers, how nice it was to learn more about her life, and others of you who had heard her last week for the very first time and said you were forever hooked on her poetry. You will also notice that I'm changing where I am coming to you from today. Last week I was in Havoc Horse Lounge. Today I'm in our church library, and hopefully some of that dinniness and tinniness and echoing or whatever that you heard last week will be dissipated in this particular area. I also want to remind all of you that this is not a professional talk such as a TED Talk or a graduate class in poetry on Mary Oliver or anything like that. This is simply an adult education class coming to you from the Coral Gables Congregational United Church of Christ, and it was never meant to be out in the universe, but of course with the pandemic that is happening all around us, our classes are now being recorded or online. So any quotes or information I share that I have not properly credited, I apologize now and hope that in the beloved name of Mary Oliver that you will forgive me and know that you are appreciated for the information or insight you have offered. When we left off last Sunday, we were talking about the theology of Mary Oliver. If you remember, she claimed early on not to be a religious person, although much of her writings, even her early writings, were seen as deeply spiritual or expressive even of the Christian faith. You'll remember she had gone to Sunday school as a young person. She had learned a lot of our biblical stories and church traditions and scripture that are marks of the Christian faith. And the concept of resurrection was and is portrayed often in her poetry. Also, as you heard me say last week, in 2005, Oliver's longtime beloved partner for 40 years, Molly Cook, or M as she fondly referred to her, died of cancer. It was a year later that Oliver published her book, Thirst, a collection of poems that really grapples with grief and reveals Oliver's curiosity about and increasing comfort with the language of faith and the rituals and rhythms of liturgical practice. And I can't help but think, isn't that how many of us so often return to faith or even the church after we confront a particularly difficult time in our lives, or we're going through grief or sorrow. It'll be interesting following the pandemic, when we're all allowed out of our safe spaces again, how many more might return to the church or return to their faith, seeking some answers or wanting some understanding of what has happened, and even putting some hope to it or some comfort. And so at the end of Cook's life, as Mary Oliver was reflecting on their time together and on Cook's death, she produced this book, Thirst, and in it really does encounter faith in a much more serious and deep way. In fact, what caught many of Oliver's fans and followers kind of off guard was how overtly Christian the book is and her poetry. In it, there are poems about Gethsemane and about the Eucharist, about prayer, the donkey that Jesus rode on into Jerusalem, and confessing that God was in Christ, reconciling this beautiful but broken world to himself. Well, one of her poems in Thirst is entitled Praying, and I'd like to share that with you right now. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot or a few small stones. Just pay attention, then patch a few words together, and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak. If you will notice in this poem, she's talking again about what we talked about a lot last week, that of paying attention, of being aware to all of life around you, and finding in even the most ordinary of times or situations or things something so extraordinary. And she says if we but still our busy minds and pay attention, that the physical creation provokes in us astonishment, joy, and gratitude. And not that Oliver ignores the darkness, but other poems in Thirst speak of unanswered love and brokenness, darkness, and the dull, brutish ways of humankind. So she does speak of darkness and sadness, but also in so many ways of light and life. In her poetry book, Thirst, there are also several poems that are written as prayers, often with a kind of convert's zeal, but also in the ways of the psalm. If any of you are psalm readers, then you kind of know how the psalmist often writes or lays out the words of the psalms. They often start out with such angst or bitterness or calling out or crying, saying, "Oh God, how have you failed me? The world is bitter and terrible and I'm in pain and everything is going up in hell in a handbasket and everything is wrong." But then the psalmist always comes around and goes, "But you, O God, are the greatest. You're the best. You comfort me. You guide me. You give me love. You offer me hope and so forth." So there's always this dichotomy of like, oh my gosh, how are we going to get through this? But God, you will see us through. And in some ways, in Thirst, this is how some of her more Christian-oriented poems are. So let me read to you this one called 6 Recognitions of the Lord. I know a lot of fancy words. I tear them from my heart and my tongue. Then I pray. Lord God, mercy is in your hands. Pour me a little, and tenderness too. My need is great. Beauty walks so freely and with such gentleness. Impatience puts a halter on my face, and I run away over the green fields wanting your voice, your tenderness, but having to do with only the sweet grasses of the fields against my body. When I first found you, I was filled with light. Now the darkness grows, and it is filled with crooked things, bitter and weak, each one bearing my name. I lounge on the grass, that's all, so simple. Then I lie back until I'm inside the cloud that is just above me, but very high and shaped like a fish, or perhaps not. Then I enter the place of not thinking, not remembering, not wanting. When the blue jay cries out his riddle in his carping voice, I return, but I go back. The threshold is always near. Over and back, over and back. Then I rise. Maybe I rub my face as though I have been asleep, but I have not been asleep. I have been, as I say, inside the cloud, or perhaps the lily floating on the water. Then I go back to town, to my own house, my own life, which has now become brighter and simpler, somewhere I have never been before. In this poem, I think Mary Oliver is recognizing her own weakness. She realizes the fact that she cannot bring anything, not words, not even emotion, into her prayers. That she simply exists in that moment. And she realizes that God and God alone can fill her and can cleanse her, can satisfy her desperation. And again, like the psalmist, she pleads. No, she actually cries out for God's intervention in her life. In another poem called The Vast Ocean Begins Just Outside Our Church, the Eucharist, Oliver's experience of Christ's real presence is in the bread and the wine, kind of gives new understanding or insight in her longing to see Jesus, as she has described on the shore, just walking, beautiful man. In some ways, this is actually a poem about a great theological debate or argument that has happened over the centuries and that surrounds the sacraments. Some of you have maybe engaged in this argument as well between transubstantiation and consubstantiation, or Zwingli's view of a memorial or Calvin's view of a spiritual presence, all having to do about what the gifts of bread and cup are. What do they mean? Are they truly the life and blood and body of Jesus Christ after we bless them? Or is it that Jesus is present in them with how we share them and then go out and serve? Or is it a dinner, a memorial dinner per se? So she seeks to talk about this and answer this in her own way in this poem, once again called The Vast Ocean Begins Just Outside Our Church, the Eucharist. Something has happened to the bread and the wine. They have been blessed. What now? The body leans forward to receive the gift from the priest's hand, then the chalice. They are something else now from what they were before this began. I want to see Jesus, maybe in the clouds or on the shore, just walking, beautiful man, and clearly someone else besides. On the hard days, I ask myself if I ever will. Also, there are times my body whispers to me that I have. I think commenting on this poem, Oliver can really tell us what she was implying or wanting to get to. And in some ways, these are wise words for theologians or those of us who kind of pride ourselves on being theologians. She says this: centuries ago, theologians claimed they had parsed with precision how God acted on the bread and wine during the celebration of the Eucharist. This wasn't helpful. Their lust for certitude bruised a mystery which was best left alone. It eventually birthed theological wars about the nature of a meal that was ironically intended to mend, not tear apart. I don't need to know what happened to the bread and wine to experience the oceanic love of God that I feel when I receive it, any more than a newborn needs to know the mother's name and address to see and feel the adoration in her gaze. To which I wish all of God's people would say, Amen, sister. I think she is absolutely so right in that. it's not so much maybe what happens to that bread and to that cup, but rather what happens to us and what it compels us to do and to be. As someone else has said, that, when Oliver gets it right, when she allows her inquisitiveness and her delight to direct attention away from herself, she really does shed fresh insight on familiar stories and new wisdom on well-torn and well-worn pieties. Although Oliver may have begun to treat theological themes more frequently toward the end of her life and toward the end of much of her poetry writing, and to use Christian language more explicitly, she did remain true to what her work had always truly been about, pointing us, the readers, to the gift of presence, reminding us in poems that are often deceptively simple of what it means to attend to what it is before us in any given moment. So what did she teach us? Remember from last week? She taught us to pay attention, to be astonished, and then to tell about it. She would often say that we miss the visual cues in front of our eyes because we're simply too busy not paying attention, not looking. As Annie Dillard so acutely observed in Teaching a Stone to Talk, that we are often like, and I'm going to quote her here, I love this, cheerful, brainless tourist on a package tour of the absolute, having coffee and donuts on deck C, presuming that someone is minding the ship, correcting the course, avoiding icebergs and shoals, fueling the engines, watching the radar screen, noting the weather reports radioed in from shore. But are we looking around, paying attention to the reef, the shoreline, the ship in our course? As Dillard asked, are we even attentive to the sleeping God who may wake someday and take offense, or the waking God who may draw us out to where we can never return? One of my favorite movies, it was not a great movie, but there's this one little section, so it's one of my favorite movies. It's called Joe and the Volcano. It had Tom Hanks in, I think, Meg, whatever, Ryan, yes, her, she was in it. Anyway, they get thrown out of a volcano and they're out floating on a raft in this great sea, and, it's a long adventure and all. But what Tom Hanks says then to Meg Ryan's character, that most people go through life asleep, but those who are awake are constantly amazed. And I think that's exactly what Mary Oliver is saying to us. Be alert, be aware, be astonished, find the awe, AWE, in life, and it changes you and provides you with insight. So just don't float along on the raft, but pay attention to everything around you. And so maybe I would pose to you this day, are you paying attention? Are you really being alert, even in this very unique, singular time in our lives, this time of living in the midst of a pandemic? Are we aware of all of the extraordinary things that are happening? Are you catching glimpses of perhaps the joy or insights into life, or the tenderness that is happening around you, or the gifts of grace and of hope that are in even the smallest, most ordinary of ways? Well, her first poem in this book, Thirst, is called Messenger. And in some ways, I think this summarizes so much of Mary Oliver's poetry. My work is loving the world. Here the sunflowers, there the hummingbird, equal seekers of sweetness. Here the quickening yeast, there the blue plums. Hear the clam deep in the speckled sand. Are my boots old? Is my coat torn? Am I no longer young and still not half perfect? Let me keep my mind on what matters, which is my work, which is mostly standing still and learning to be astonished. The sheep in the pasture and the pasture, which is mostly rejoicing, since all the ingredients are here, which is gratitude, to be given a mind and a heart, and these body clothes, a mouth with which to give shouts of joy to the moth and the wren, to the sleepy dug-up clam, telling them all over and over how it is that we live forever. I think that's such a beautiful poem, and one that I always say they're all my favorites, but I love even that opening line so much, that my work is loving the world. Just imagine if all of us were to say that our work together is loving the world. I often think that Jesus says to us, what is the greatest thing we do? What are we called? What are the commandments that we are to follow? And he says simply, and with much difficulty for us, that we are to love God, love neighbor, love self. Isn't that about loving the world? I want to share with you one other poem that I'm really attracted to. I am very intrigued by the love story between Molly Cook, and Mary Oliver, that 40-year journey together in a time and era when it wasn't always easy to be in a same-gender relationship. And apparently in some ways they were oil and water, salt and pepper, but that's what keeps relationships very interesting. And those who knew them said it was fun just to be invited into their space and to sit back and to watch them go at it, because Molly was a photographer, and so she saw things very visually. She would see things through a camera lens, whereas Mary Oliver would see it through the lens of her eye and would verbalize it and or write it. So they really complement each other, but they also apparently had some real differences. And it is out of those differences that Mary Oliver, after M passed away, wrote this poem called The Whistler. And for me, it's just a breath-stopping poem that brings full circle her opening reflections on never really knowing those who are nearest to us. And it's kind of a beautiful testament to what another wise woman once wrote. You can never know anyone as completely as you want, but that's okay. Love is better. So she writes this poem. All of a sudden, she began to whistle. By all of a sudden, I mean that for more than 30 years, she had not whistled. It was thrilling. At first I wondered who was in the house, what stranger. I was upstairs reading and she was downstairs. As from the throat of a wild and cheerful bird, not caught but visiting, the sounds warbled and slid and doubled back and larked and soared. Finally, I said, "Is that you? Is that you whistling?" "Yes," she said. "I used to whistle a long time ago. Now I see I can still whistle." And cadence after cadence, she strolled through the house whistling. I know her so well, I thought. Elbow and ankle, mood and desire, anguish and frolic, anger too. And the devotions. And for all that, do we even begin to know each other? Who is this I've been living with for 30 years? This clear, dark, lovely whistler. That poem actually is challenged me in some ways to pay a little more attention to my spouse. I kind of think that I know him well after, gosh, we've been together over 40 years now, and I think, oh, I probably know everything about him. Although I have to say, almost daily, he does surprise me, and to pay attention to that there are still surprises to unfold from our lovers or our friends or the people that we adore or care about, or our family members. And again, if we just pay attention and be astonished, and then we can tell about it. I'd like to just very briefly talk a bit about Oliver's relationship with animals. As many of you know, I'm an animal lover, especially dogs, but I love all animals. And animals were also such a part of the natural order of things for which she was so observant. And on her walk, she kept her eyes peeled always for animals, which she thought about with her great intensity and intimacy, and which often appear in her work, not so much as separate species, but as kind of kindred spirits. In her poem, August, Oliver wrote about joy from the perspective of a gregarious bear. Listen to this. When the blackberries hang swollen in the woods and the brambles nobody owns, I spend all day among the high branches, reaching my ripped arms thinking of nothing, cramming the black honey of summer into my mouth. All day my body accepts what it is. In the dark creeks that run by there is this thick paw of my life darting among the black bells, the leaves. There is this happy tongue. In 2013, she published Dog Songs. I think I have that right around here. Dog Songs. It's absolutely my favorite because I like the poems in it, but I love the picture of the dog on the front. And it is a book of poems and short prose pieces about the passionate attachment between humans and canines. If any of you are dog lovers or have a dog, it's right up there with Marley. It's a great book. And she wrote verse after verse about her little rescue mutt named Percy, and about how he would gaze up at her as though she were the most wonderful, perfect person in the world. Hear these words. For I will consider my dog Percy, for he was made small but brave of heart. For if he met another dog, he would kiss her in kindness. For when he slept, he snored only a little. For he could be silly and noble in the same moment. For when he spoke, he remembered the trumpet, and when he scratched, he struck the floor like a drum. For he ate only the finest food and drank only the purest of water, yet he would nibble of the dead fish also. For he came to me impaired and therefore certain of short life, yet thoroughly rejoiced in each day. For he took his medicines without argument, for he played easily with the neighbor's bull mastiff. For when he came upon mud, he splashed through it. For he was an instrument for the children to learn benevolence upon. For he listened to poems as well as love talk. For when he sniffed, it was as if he were being pleased by every part of the world. For when he sickened, he rallied as many times as he could. For he was a mixture of gravity and waggery. For we humans can seek self-destruction in ways he never dreamed of. For he took actions both cunning and reckless, yet refused always to offer himself to be admonished. For his sadness, though without words, was understandable. For there was nothing sweeter than his peace when at rest. For there was nothing brisker than his life when in motion. For he was of the tribe of wolf. For when I went away, he would watch for me at the window, for he loved me. For he suffered before I found him, and never forgot it. For he loved Anne. For when he lay down to enter sleep, he did not argue about whether or not God made him. For he could fling himself upside down and laugh a true laugh. For he loved his friend Ricky. For he would dig holes in the sand and then let Ricky lie in them. For I would often see his shape in the clouds, and this is a continual blessing. Isn't that beautiful? I love that poem. I did promise you that I would share with you a couple other women poets, and I don't have much time. I see here just a couple of minutes, but let me share with you two others, and then I want to end this with you hearing a couple poems read by Mary Oliver herself. I think that makes all the world of difference to hear the poet read her own work. But Marge Piercy is an American poet, novelist, and social activist, and her works include Woman on the Edge of Time, He, She, and It. And in 1993, she won the Arthur C. Clarke Award. She's a New York Times best-selling author and a novelist, and is very, very good. But if we take what Mary Oliver has taught us about being aware of always paying attention, being astonished, and then telling about it, I think Marge Piercy does it so well in this piece of poetry that she writes. If you listen carefully to the description of all of the colors: purple as tulips in May, mauve into lush velvet, purple as the stained blackberries leave on the lips, on the hands, the purple of ripe grapes, sunlit and warm as flesh. Every day I will give you a color, like a new flower in a bud vase on your desk. Every day I will paint you as women color each other, with henna on hands and on feet. Red as henna, as cinnamon as coals after the fire is banked, the cardinal and the feeder, the roses tumbling on the arbor, their weight bending the wood, the red of the syrup I make from petals. Orange as the perfumed fruit, hanging their globes on the glossy tree. Orange as pumpkins in the field. Orange as butterfly weed and the monarchs who come to eat it. Orange as my cat running lithe through the high grass. Yellow as a goat's wise and wicked eyes. Yellow as a hill of daffodils. Yellow as dandelions by the highway. Yellow as butter and egg yolks. Yellow as a school bus stopping you. Yellow as a slicker in the downpour. Here is my bouquet. Here is a sing-song of all the things you make me think of. Here is a bleak praise for the height and depth of you, and the width too. Here is my box of new crayons at your feet. She goes on in that poem then to also describe colors of green and blue and cobalt, but that gives you a little taste of how this description of color is so intense, and we can identify with a yellow school bus or a hill of daffodils so well. Again, it's about paying attention and being astonished. And then Audre Lorde. Lorde was born in New York City to Caribbean immigrants from Grenada. She sailed in Harlem, and she was nearsighted to the point of being legally blind, the youngest of three daughters. She grew up hearing her mother's stories about the West Indies. She learned to talk while she learned to read already at the age of 4, and her mother taught her to write at just about the same time, and she wrote her first poem when she was only in 8th grade. But this is one that I really like of hers, and it's called To Be of Use. The people I love the best jump into work head first, without dallying in the shallows, and swim off with sure strokes almost out of sight. They seem to become natives of that element, the black, sleek heads of seals bouncing like half-submerged balls. I love people who harness themselves, an ox to a heavy cart, who pull like water buffalo with massive patience, who strain in the mud and the muck to move things forward, who do what has to be done again and again. I want to be with people who submerge in the task, who go into the fields to harvest and work in a row and pass the bags along, who are not parlor generals and field deserters, but move in a common rhythm when the food must come in or the fire be put out. The work of the world is common as mud. Botched, it smears the hands, crumbles to dust. But the thing worth doing well done has a shape that satisfies, clean and evident. Greek amphoras for wine or oil. Hopi vases that held corn are put in museums, but you know they were made to be used. The pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real. There are so many wonderful poets out there, so many wonderful women poets, and Maya Angelou. The list just goes on, and I hope that maybe our time together will kind of lead you in this time of more quiet and sanctuary and being sequestered, that you might find some other poems that mean a lot to you. Since I always love these sessions to be time for questions and answers or feedback or hear what you have to say, and since we're not able to do that, I would still love to hear what you have to say. So any thoughts or reflections, please email me or text me and let me know what you think. So I'm going to leave you with some readings by the one and only Mary Oliver. Well, I thank you for being with me. And as I send you off, as I have said throughout this session, the session before, if nothing else that we might take from Mary Oliver is that as we journey through this life, that we indeed pay attention, that we be astonished, and then we tell about it. All the best. Thanks for being with me.
I go down to the shore. I go down to the shore in the morning, and depending on the hour, the waves are rolling in or moving out, and I say, oh, I am miserable. What should I do? And the sea says in its lovely voice, excuse me, I have work to do. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began. Though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save.